Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am an English teacher and an author of over 30 published novels. And on this week's episode, I'm excited to have Utah writer Zak Podmore. He's going to be talking about his new book out from Torrey House Press, and it is called Life After Deadpool, Lake Powell's Last Days and the Rebirth of the Colorado River, which is a lot to discuss. We're going to do our best to cover some of it and get people an idea of what's going on in this area and with the water issues. But before we dive into that, Zak, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. My name is Zak Podmore. I live in Southeast Utah. I've been a water reporter for about 10 years now. I've worked for the Salt Lake Tribune most recently, as well as a lot of freelance work. This is my second book from Torrey House Press, both of which focus on rivers in the Southwest. It's good to be on the show.
Well, I am happy to have you and interested to talk about this. It's been coming up more and more in conversation, I think, not just here where we deal with it, but reaching a wider audience of people who I think across the country are starting to realize we might actually have to address this, where it's kind of just been assumed in many cases. Either it'll sort itself out or it's water. We'll always have water. And maybe in certain areas that might be true, but certainly not here where it's a constant concern and something that needs to be addressed. Tell us a little bit about the premise for Life After Deadpool and just what we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. Yeah, water is very complicated in the Southwest, as everybody knows, with the layers of legal precedent and interstate agreements and individual water rights, tribal water rights that all go into determining who's able to use what water. And you add in the biggest water infrastructure in the country, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, Lake Mead and Lake Powell on top of that. And then you throw in climate change, which has depleted the Colorado River's flow by around 20% since the year 2000. And you get a story that you could tell from a lot of different angles. As you mentioned, everyone's impacted by water issues if you're living in the desert, especially. But the focus of this book was to look at what's happened in Glen Canyon specifically, the canyon that filled when the Glen Canyon Dam was completed and became Lake Powell. This is a really famous environmental battle in Utah and Arizona in the 1960s when the dam was being constructed. Environmental groups like the Sierra Club at the time were saying that Glen Canyon almost certainly would have been a national park today had not been flooded by Lake Powell. It was just as beautiful as the Grand Canyon, but in the telling of that story, at least for the 1960s version, not enough people knew about what was there before the dam construction began, and nobody in a position of power like the Sierra Club fought the dam project with enough force. So this is a really, famous tale of environmental loss. It, of course, created Lake Powell, which is an amazing houseboat destination. They're enjoyed by millions every year. It also stored a lot of water. But the levels in Lake Powell started going down in the year 2000 when we entered a drought in the Southwest, which is related to climate change. And in 2021, when I started on this book project, Lake Powell had just reached record low levels. That record would be repeatedly broken over the coming years until Lake Powell was just 20% full in the spring of 2023. It's come up a little bit since then, but in the midst of this water crisis and climate crisis in the Southwest, we see this landscape that was considered to be lost for generations to come, coming back to life. There's 100,000 acres of land that were once covered by Lake Powell, and there's been a really remarkable ecological rebirth on that land as trees sprout again, beavers move back in. There's 60-foot tall cottonwood trees now next to places where fishing boats sank 30 years ago, and it's a really dynamic, interesting, smaller story happening within the bigger water story in the basin. So that's the focus of the book. It's not all doom and gloom, but it does get into some of these complexities and acknowledges that there's a significant ecological restoration already underway in Glen Canyon because of the drought. So it's an interesting topic, or it was an interesting topic to write about for me because has that complexity.
A lot of complexity. Yeah, that was something I'm generally familiar with the history and some of the issues that have come up here and there. My ex-husband actually works for the Bureau of Reclamation, so some of that I became a little bit more familiar with through his work, and some of the issues and especially the legal aspects of dealing with water. So many different layers that have to be navigated, and it was really interesting to see how you built a lot of these into a narrative that you can follow and you can read along. It's not a traditional story. There aren't a characters going on a journey type of story, but you do present this in a somewhat narrative fashion that makes it really easy to take in the information and to consider it in bits and pieces that I felt like helped it from being overwhelming in the scope of what we're talking about. So I wanted to ask you about your approach to coming at this subject in that sort of style rather than just going full in on the data and the scientific side of things, which could be a bit overwhelming for lay readers who are maybe new to this topic and some of the issues.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That was definitely the goal for the book, was to present a lot of different sides to this issue and describe the changes that have happened in Glen Canyon since the year 2000 without, I was trying to add characters in terms of the experts that I met out in the side canyons or on Lake Powell who help describe different aspects of those changes that we've been undergoing out there. So there's a chapter on sediment, massive quantities of sediment that have been trapped in Lake Powell since the Glen Canyon Dam was completed in 1963, and I spent some time out there with geologists who are studying these sediment layers and how they behave and how they're moving into Glen Canyon. There's a chapter on archaeology and the tens of thousands of cultural sites that were flooded by Lake Powell and are now starting to reemerge. There's a chapter on the ecology and what I was talking about earlier, the ecological rebirth in the side canyon, how native species, the kind of species we want to see growing in canyon country, are coming back on their own without any active human intervention. They're out competing the invasive species. I broke down the book by each chapter has a different focus in its topic, but each one is also driven by a narrative of exploring these places firsthand. So there's kayak trips in there, crossing Lake Powell and getting caught in bad windstorms, and there's trips from motorboats that involve hiking up these side canyons, seeing the cultural sites that are reemerging with archaeologists who work for the Navajo Nation. I wanted to, of course, include a lot of information as a journalist. That was the goal, but I wanted to make it accessible and hopefully entertaining as well.
I think you hit the marks on those. I learned a lot, but also I really enjoyed the story aspects of it and getting to know the people involved in all of this, because I think it makes a difference when you realize this isn't just a piece of land. This isn't this abstract thing that doesn't touch the lives of people, that there are so many different organizations and groups who are putting tons of time and energy and research into studying what's going on and looking at how to deal with it and what, like you said, maybe just needs to be left to do what it's doing as these areas are becoming exposed, but then what areas still need some sort of intervention, whether that's in the legal sphere or working through the many parties involved in the water rights and all of that. It really is touching a lot of lives, and getting to see that and the people working in it, I thought was a really great way to approach it and see the impact on individuals who are involved in this whole wide-ranging process.
Yeah, I certainly enjoy books that have compelling characters in them, and I've met a lot of people who were like characters in their own right out there who are doing really interesting work studying the changes in Glen Canyon. And the question that kind of looms over the whole book is whether or not the Glen Canyon Dam is necessary anymore, or whether it's starting to become an impediment to water deliveries throughout the Colorado River Basin. And the design of the Glen Canyon Dam is such that it can't release water when the levels in Lake Powell get very low. You can't actively release water through the dam because there's no outlets. So I think we're entering a new phase for the story of Glen Canyon, which I try to capture in the book. which starting to hear water managers, people who have typically supported these big reservoir projects that are capable of generating hydropower and storing a lot of water from wet years and releasing it during dry years. We're starting to hear some of those groups question whether the Glen Canyon Dam needs to be redesigned, or needs to be modified in some way to avoid this threat of dead pool, which is in the book's title, which means when the level of Lake Powell reaches the lowest outlets on the Glen Canyon Dam, which are still hundreds of feet above the river, there would be 100 miles of reservoir still backing up into Lake Powell and Glen Canyon, but there'd be no way to get that water out and downstream to the 27 million people who rely on it in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico without some very creative thinking or likely a redesign of the dam itself. So yes, it all comes back to people who rely on this water and animals and plants that rely on this landscape as well. But there's a lot of changes being forced upon water users in the Southwest because of the drought we've been in for 24 years now.
Those of us who live here kind of see that and live with it. I think it's an interesting way in this book to kind of show to a wider audience that some of the things you talk about, the design, that it's kind of talked about, and how I always heard it referred to, it's just this like engineering marvel and this major accomplishment and very positively painted. But you point out some of the design flaws, like not having any lower outlets, and just in general, kind of the lack of forward thinking that was happening at the time when this was being designed and built. And at one point, you have a quote talking about, well, that's somebody else's problem in the future. We're not worrying about that right now. And just how often that has been the attitude toward things like this and toward environmental issues just in general of, well, this is going to be the best thing for us right now. And yeah, maybe it might be a problem in the future, but it's not going to be our problem. We'll let everyone else sort that out when we get to that. And I thought it was very interesting that this really made that mindset a focus in how much we can't do that. We've really got to think through the consequences and what might be needed in the future based on a range of changes. I think you do a good job of pointing out when we only think about ourselves and our current situation, that's really never going to work out in the long run.
Yeah. I think it came as a shock to everyone who was around in the 1950s and 60s, or it would have come as a shock to them if they were still around, that the Glen Canyon Dam is at the cusp of failing so soon. Because any dam, the future is determined for any dam that it'll eventually fill with sediment and need to be decommissioned or will turn into a waterfall, the river pouring over the top of the dam with sediment packed behind it. And for a huge reservoir like Lake Powell, the estimated timeline for that to happen is 700 years. That's quite a ways off still before it's completely full of sediment and it can no longer store water. But we are at a point where we need to think about whether the Glen Canyon Dam is well designed, not because of that eventual sediment issue, but because of the lack of water in the Colorado River that people thought was going to be there to be able to fill these reservoirs more often than has actually been the case. So, as I mentioned earlier, Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the country. It's slightly larger than Lake Powell. And then plus there are all these other little dams throughout the Colorado River Basin, or some of them quite large, even if they're smaller than the Hoover Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam. But we have Navajo Dam on the San Juan River, Blue Mesa on the Gunnison River, Flaming Gorge on the Green River, a lot of dams below the Hoover Dam on the California-Arizona border. And if you were to take water from all of these reservoirs, every single reservoir in the Colorado River Basin today, and put it into Lake Mead wouldn't even be full. So we have way too much storage in the Colorado River Basin to be able to take advantage of the benefits the dams provide. If you have too many buckets, too much storage, and not enough water to fill them, then it starts to create a lot of problems. And that's the situation we're in now in the basin.
Well, and it's interesting what you point out, just for one, kind of the design issues with the Glen Canyon Dam, but also just that idea of what is needed where and how that gets managed over the course of time. You kind of find these pockets where people settle and it's like, well, we need more water here to sustain the population or to make farming have the water more consistently for that. And it seems like, it kind of pops up on a basis where it's needed, but the overall scope of how these all worked together and then how to navigate, there's contracts, there's treaties of who gets how much water and how it all gets divvied up. But so much of that, it's like when you run into these issues of, oh, things have changed drastically from when that was made, there's a whole new set of problems that come into play. And it's very hard to get everyone involved in those to actually work together to come up with a solution that's going to be workable, whether that's, redesigning certain things or adjusting contracts. Not only is the problem multifaceted, but the solution also seems to be something that it's not something that someone can come up and say, okay, I've solved it all. Everybody should agree with this. Let's move forward. Because there are so many moving parts and so many parties involved in this whole massive network of water storage and the rights that go along with that. And you get into that some as well, talking about the different players and how some people are attempting to sort it through, and then hopefully fewer people are ignoring or trying not to deal with it so much. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your research into that and your discussions with some of the people involved with these ongoing negotiations and work to find solutions.
Sure. Well, I think backing up a little bit, the book presents the case that it would be beneficial to modify the Glen Canyon Dam, both from a water delivery perspective and from an environmental perspective. That could mean drilling tunnels around the base of the dam so that that water that would otherwise be trapped in Lake Powell at Deadpool could be released if needed. And the side effect of that would be allowing this ecological restoration to continue in Glen Canyon. It's easier in theory, I guess, to do that on Lake Powell because there are no major diversions from Lake Powell. So unlike Lake Mead, which supplies the city of Las Vegas, or the reservoirs below the Hoover Dam that supply the Central Arizona project that goes to Phoenix and Tucson, or canals that go to Los Angeles and San Diego and supply some of the most productive farmland in the country too, in the Imperial Valley in southern Arizona there by Yuma. Lake Powell is just for water storage from a water management perspective and hydropower generation. There's a very small diversion that goes to the city at Page. That's the only, in the Lecce chapter of the Navajo Nation, but that's the only diversion from Lake Powell itself. And low water on Lake Powell has already impacted that diversion. There's a discussion in Page right now of potentially drilling wells to supply the municipal water instead of trying to get water from Lake Powell, or to put some other straw into the river or the lake there to be able to divert water to that town. But there's only about 6,000 people, I think, in Page. So nothing compared to the size of the city of Las Vegas, of course. And there are other ways to get that water than having the second largest reservoir in the country for a relatively small town. So yeah, the players involved, there's the upper basin. So under the Colorado River Compact of 1922, just to get into some of the important history of water management in the basin, the 7 Colorado River states were divided into 2 basins. The upper basin states of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. And in theory, each of those basins was supposed to get half the water in the Colorado River. It hasn't worked out that way because there's less water than people expected to be there in 1922 when the compact was signed. So the lower basin states use a lot more water than the upper basin states. New Mexico and Wyoming and Nevada all use a very small amount of water, California say. But the lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada, have supported the studies that are being done by the Bureau of Reclamation to look at ways that the Glen Canyon Dam could be modified. And also powerful farmers in the lower basin have supported those studies as well. So this is a really different place than the one we were in the 1990s, say, when Lake Powell was working as intended. There were some more or fringe or environmental groups that were calling for the decommissioning of the Glen Canyon Dam, but water managers and states in the basin didn't really take that idea too seriously because the dam and Lake Powell seemed to be working as intended. That's not the case anymore. We were just one bad snow year away from losing hydropower generation on the Glen Canyon Dam last year and facing major water delivery problems to the lower basin. So the upper basin states have long liked having Lake Powell there to be able to meet their obligations to water delivery downstream under that compact, but it's clear that things aren't going as smoothly as they were in the past. So if the Glen Canyon Dam were modified, the system would operate more smoothly of getting water downstream during back-to-back drought years than is currently possible. Of course, the major impact would be on the recreational users who love being able to houseboat or jet ski or fish on Lake Powell, which is one of probably the most beautiful reservoir in the world to be able to do those activities. So that would be a real impact, but those aren't water users necessarily. It might actually benefit farmers and cities to modify the Glen Canyon Dam, or at least that's the argument that I make in the book.
I think that's an interesting balance trying to strike in today's culture. We value recreation. We put importance on the ability to go out and enjoy the area around us, but we do have to balance that with the needs and what is environmentally sound practices. And that is a difficult bargain to make in a lot of cases. You talked about how much the population growth in some of these areas, especially like in Arizona and the Phoenix area, has changed the water needs and all those different elements that come into play. Trying to find something that it's probably never going to be something everybody's going to be happy with and everybody gets what they want, but trying to balance the needs and the uses for that. And it seems like in your book, like you said, it's not doom and gloom. You bring up where the issues are, but you do highlight those areas where people are starting to realize, okay, we need to actually find some solutions and work through some of this. And it does seem like you talk about more an atmosphere of trying to work together for the most part. And it's interesting how you point out kind of the history of different groups who have been calling for, asking for change, advocating for decades, and often ignored. But now, as we're seeing that these issues are not getting any better, and they're not really expected to get any better, that those voices who have been speaking up for quite a while are getting more time to be heard and taken seriously.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I think the shift has been pretty slow. So, big environmental groups that might have opposed the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam, like the Sierra Club in the 1960s, were kind of took a backseat on the issue once that battle was lost and Lake Powell filled. So there's pretty much the groups that are celebrating and studying the restoration of Glen Canyon that's already underway on those 100,000 acres of land are the minority even in the environmental world, I would say. There are groups like the Glen Canyon Institute in Salt Lake City, which has had this as its focus since it was founded in the mid-1990s. But some of the bigger, more powerful groups don't really have an explicit position on how Lake Powell should be managed. And then that's interesting because there's states that aren't really necessarily interested in the environmental issues happening in Glen Canyon, the trees that are coming back and the habitat that's being restored, that are calling for Glen Canyon Dam to be modified if necessary. So as I mentioned earlier, California, Arizona, and Nevada have all at least supported those studies, if not the actual modifications themselves. And those studies are being carried out by the Bureau of Reclamation, which of course built and manages the dam and doesn't want to modify its infrastructure or lose its storage capacity in the basin unless it's absolutely necessary. But we're getting close to a point where it does seem like it could be necessary, since we've emptied Lake Powell so much already to meet water demand in the Southwest while having less water available in the river. So Lake Powell got so low because it's really hard to reduce water use in the basin. And we were able to draw from Lake Powell and Lake Mead to sustain a pretty steady water demand in the Southwest for over 2 decades now, even though there's less water in the river itself. But we've reached the point where that isn't possible for too much longer, especially if we get really dry years like we saw in 2020 and 2021, 2022, that crashed the storage levels in Lake Powell and Lake Mead in just a matter of years. On Lake Powell, there was a 120-foot decline in the lake level. So when you're in your boat out there, you can look up and see that bathtub ring marking the high water line that's on the cliffs of Lake Powell. Between 2019 and 2023, that bathtub ring got 120 feet bigger. So this is something that anyone who's spent time on Lake Powell has witnessed firsthand just how quickly the water levels were going down. And that's only possible to a certain extent before it starts to really impact everyone downstream who relies on Colorado River water.
Yeah, that was shocking in the initial part of the book where you're talking about the 2 rafting trips that you went on and the massive differences just over that decade. And then within the last few years, like seeing those drops, you think something so big shouldn't be able to see change that rapidly. but it is. It's, like you said, the visible markings of where those have dropped and making it, really in your face at this point that these are massive changes that need to be dealt with. And I hope that this book helps bring a lot of those issues to people's attention, because I think the more the average person knows about some of these situations, the more that can start to influence some of the people who are making the decisions at the higher levels, because it starts to build and you're bringing that awareness to an issue that maybe people kind of knew some about, have heard a little bit here and there, but you really put everything together in a very digestible package that for the everyday reader, like I said, I'm not familiar with the science behind a lot of what you're talking about, but it's very understandable. And I came away from it feeling like I had a better grasp on what the issues are currently, what some of the proposed solutions are. And it's something that, I'm certainly not an expert, but I feel like I could engage in a conversation that I could understand and be able to communicate about that with other people. So I really appreciated that, because it is a big issue and it's important. And there's a lot of the times that I feel like, well, geez, I don't know enough about, this or that or the other to feel like I have something to say about it. And I think books like this really help the everyday person who wants to know and be part of the conversation do that a little bit better.
I appreciate that. And I don't have a science background. I certainly don't have a background in water law. So as a reporter, I think that can be an advantage sometimes if I don't have a bunch of technical training in a certain scientific field, but I'm talking to an expert in that field. I have to get the expert to boil it down for me, break it down, and explain it in a way that I can understand. And I think that helps when I go to write it. If I've already had to go through that process myself, at least the goal is to try and make it accessible to anyone who, like me, doesn't have that kind of expertise. So I'm glad that came through in the book, because I think these issues aren't something that should be confined to different experts only, because they're issues that impact all of us. So being able to communicate those issues, which is certainly what the scientists and even the policy experts want to do, helps us make better informed decisions for the future, and also just be aware of what's happening on the ground, even if we haven't seen it or studied it firsthand.
Absolutely. Like I said, I feel like you did that so well, and I really hope people take a minute to look up the book, get a copy, read more about this. It's such an important thing to be more aware of. And like I said, I knew we would kind of barely scratch the surface on everything that you talk about in the book. I had lots more trails to go off on, but we are just about out of time. But I wanted to give you a chance to let people know where can they find you and the book and learn more and get involved.
The book's available anywhere where books are sold. You can find it online. It's Life After Deadpool, 2 words in Deadpool. This isn't the Marvel character. This is referring to the potential future scenario on Lake Powell when all that water gets trapped in there because of the design of the dam. So Life After Deadpool, my name's Zak Podmore, and you can publisher is Torrey House Press. You can buy the book directly from the publisher, or ask your local bookstore to order it for you, or ask your library to order it. It's also available in ebook. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on the show and discuss these issues.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm glad I got the opportunity to read the book, and it's been really great chatting with you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you too.